Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm back with you today. We are going to be starting out a new sound design series. And in this series, I'm going to be going over a lot of the basic bass sounds that you run into in electronic music production. And there's not really a specific terminology that's shared between a lot of these. You'll find that people sometimes name them similar things, but there's not particularly like a guide out there for you, for instance, for what they're called. It's just kind of made up on the spot. So these are just going to have the names that I've made up for them. If you guys want to call them something else, you're more than welcome to, but you should get the basic idea of what they sound like when you want to go in and make them. So the format of these videos going from here forward might change a little bit, but the basic gist is I'll have picked out a few different songs that incorporate this style of sound design into them. And I'll have a couple of references off here to the side that will be professional songs that are decently well known that incorporate this type of sound design. And then I'll have a couple of my own that I will play for you. Obviously, I'm trying to avoid copyright, so I'll only be playing the audio from my songs in this. But you guys are more than welcome to go over here and reference those to kind of get an idea of similar sounds to what I'm going for here. So the type of bass that we're going for today is going to be a swoopy type of bass. So I have picked out my own songs, clicker, and a new dimension in sound to kind of give you an idea of what we're going for here. So I'll play those now. And so this sound is obviously the reason I call it swoopy. The reason a lot of other people might call it swoopy is that it has kind of a very swishy sound to it. It's not very plucky. It's not a big bass hit. It kind of fades in and back out. And so there are a lot of different ways to accomplish this. So the way that I'm going to be doing these is we are going to start out. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to keep the same MIDI throughout all of these to demonstrate the idea or not, but I more than likely will keep the same drum setup. So I've got these drums. It's a simple 1 and 3 kick snare type layout with fills on the end of the 4 for each set of 4, and we'll just be doing 8 bars for it in total, just so we can get an idea of how we want this to flow. So that's just a general dubstep style of kick and snare, which should be decently applicable to most of the basses that we're working with here. I'm actually going to go and bump the BPM up to 128 just to kind of keep it even more relevant, because dubstep typically is at like 132, 134, somewhere in that area of the higher BPMs, but you can make it work at 128 just fine. And our MIDI for this, I just have Serum's basic saw wave set up right now on this, so you won't hear anything crazy going on. We're just going to build off of that. But the MIDI is in just G harmonic minor, because that is a key, or harmonic minor at least is a key that I use a lot in my music, so it's a little bit easier to translate from our examples down to here. But as with all music theory, feel free to go out, do your own thing with it. There's a ton of different things that you can do scale-wise and mode-wise. So we're just starting off with this basic saw. So for a swooshy sound, the first thing that you're going to want to do is kind of set up your LFOs. So there are a few different ways that you can modulate swoopy sounds. And one way is just set up 2 basic LFOs kind of like this, set them to trigger, and then you can just change your rate. So the first LFO, this is going to modulate your level predominantly. The second one will modulate your filter, and sometimes like your FM, other things like that. And a lot of the swoopy basses rely on bandpass filters. So we'll go ahead and set a bandpass filter, set it to key just for a little bit more movement, so it's not always moving the same way, which also, because these things can kind of become harmonically, trying to think of the word for it, but it can make it appear as if the root note is different because you have a big peak, obviously, rather than a full spectrum of sound. So you miss a lot of that lower quality once you get it into higher ranges. And so by having it key tracked, that kind of infers where it's moving. So even though you might not necessarily seem to have the same root note apparently, or the root note or the fundamental of the frequency won't get through as much, it will still move around. So it'll give it a more apparent fundamental, so to speak. But I digress. We'll set the cutoff on LFO2, and then we'll set this to LFO1, and we'll play it again. That'll give us a little bit more of what we're looking for. So obviously it's pretty weak. We'll move the cutoff up a little bit more to give it more of a texture. So already we're getting kind of like an acid 303 style thing going on. So I will bump this guy over onto basic shapes, and we'll just set him to a sine wave. And this is where you can get really creative, because I mean, the gist of these swoopy sounds is that most of the time they just rely on some very wobbly looking LFOs like this, and then you just modulate a lot of things through a bandpass filter, or sometimes a low pass filter works for them as well. Low pass filters work a lot more for wobbly type things, but it'll also work for this too. So I'm going to set the level to 0 on our second oscillator, and we're just going to FM it. And this is where you can really instill a lot of creativity, because you can just drop the LFO on this and it'll give it a little bit of something. But you can also do a lot of interesting things with it too. So if we hold down Alt and then drag this LFO over to 3, that'll give us the same settings, and we can give this even more of an interesting shape and reassign it over here. And so that already has given this a lot more of an interesting texture. And what we can do from here is we can mess with the octave of this to give it even more of an interesting texture to go with. So that really gives it that whippy sound when you bump this up more octaves. And I go with the sine wave on this because the lower end saw wave does give it kind of a growly sound when it's down at the lower octave, and then the sine wave gives it a really clean FM. Sines FM with saws in a really clean way, just like they do with other sines. But we could totally use like a different saw. But saws, you really have to fiddle with the FM to get it to sound as clean as you want it. But I like that, so we'll stick with that. And then just like with most other bass sounds that you make in EDM, you're going to want to put multiband compressor on in Serum because it just spices things up. And then, so for this, we could do something even more fun. We can jack this rate up. Or we could mess with this one. So now we don't have just the same sound playing every single time because we've got the two main modulating oscillators, LFO 1 and 2. Those are at eighth notes, and then LFO3 is at a quarter note. So we're starting out with low FM for the first shot of the bandpass, and then the second shot we've got a high amount of FM going on, and we can make that even more interesting by switching it off to half. And then if we wanted to make that to where it wasn't always that growing motion every single time the LFO goes, we can just turn the tracking off on this so that it's following the carrier of Ableton itself. And I actually really like what that's doing, and what we're going to do is we're going to add this to the cutoff a little bit too. And from here, what we can do is let's make this bad boy a little wider. And, you know, we can do a little bit of this. And just like all of the really interesting synth sounds, you need some distortion. So with grindy kind of sounds like this, where that low end really starts to grind just a smidge, I like to use sinefold, or at least try sinefold, see how it sounds, because it's such an aggressive distortion algorithm. And just a little bit. And so that really brings up that low end, makes it way more interesting. What we'll also do to kind of make that swoosh a little bit more intense is we will modulate the threshold by LFO1 just a hair as well. And then we can do all sorts of other interesting things to it, but that is the gist of how this is made. If you really want to widen it out, make it sound a little bit thicker, mess with a little bit of reverb before the compressor, and this is a super intense effect, so you have to use kid gloves with it and not go overboard, because if you go overboard, it's going to sound a lot like this, and it's going to be a mess. So obviously, you don't want that. So typically you want to go with a super low mix on this just to keep it subtle, and a low decay as well. And your size is honestly going to make a big difference on your decay time on this. And then the release time on your compressor is going to make a huge difference on when the reverb actually cuts in. So a slower release will make that reverb pop right back in at the end of when the synth is actually making noise. But this can also be used for really interesting effects. So if you set envelope 1 to control when this reverb cuts on, and more importantly when it cuts off, you can make it to where the reverb immediately silences after the end of the synth working. So that sounds a little bit like this. And you can make that even more interesting by adjusting the decay and size up a little bit more. And so that's a really interesting reverb technique you can use. If you want to make something like this more metallic, add in a delay, set it to a really, really short left and right time. A lot of the time it helps just take BPM off entirely. And so something like this. And then again, we can do the same trick that we did with our reverb. Yeah, you typically don't want to go too far below like 30 milliseconds, because then it really does sound like a delay. If you get really high up in here, though, you can make some crazy metallic sounds. And just like everything else, you can modulate it with an LFO too. It'll do some detuning, so it's important not to make it super high in the mix if you do that. But again, the world's your oyster. But that is one great way to make metallic sounds, especially on something as static sounding as this specific style. But that is the basics of how to make that swoopy type of bass sound. So that'll wrap up this video. The next one should be coming within the week, and that one will be over plucked style basses. So if you don't know how to make plucked style basses, hang tight. We'll be showing you how to do those next week.